my last stretch in North Dakota from the Peace Garden out to Grand Forks. I'll be taking Highway 2 through some good old Great Plains rainstorms. The Great Plains out here weren't always so tame. Like I said in many episodes past, natives in the Dakota Territory such as the Lakota, Nakota, Arapaho, and Cheyenne were very hostile to the United States. There was a series of wars over this territory, and permanent white settlement during the Manifest Destiny era was a challenge. When it came to major military engagements, the first domino to fall in this region of the US was the 1862 Dakota War in Minnesota. I have a 20-episode season, Season 2 of Two Wheels, One Compass, on this conflict. To quickly recap, the state of Minnesota was only 4 years old. The US was engulfed in the Civil War. The Dakota, living on the Sioux Reservation by treaty, were promised provisions for land that was given to the state. Those provisions were either arriving late or not at all, and the Dakota began to starve. An uprising ensued, led by the Dakota chief Little Crow. The U.S. had most of its weapons and able-bodied soldiers sent to the south to fight the Confederacy. Minnesota had to muster up what it could and met the Dakota threat with several battles. Entire towns were burned to the ground, and one of the only sieges in history on a U.S. fort by natives west of the Mississippi was here. Civilians retreated from the countryside. Finally, by the end, the Minnesotan and U.S. governments held the largest mass execution in U.S. history and crammed all the Dakota in a concentration camp under Fort Snelling before shipping the natives to other reservations out of state. Little Crow was then killed in a shootout sometime later. The warriors under Little Crow were still massing, however. They'd retreated into either Canada across the Medicine Line or into the Dakota Territory, which at the time would be a lawless outback for Minnesota for 30 or so years, or the next generation or two. The hit-and-run tactics of the Dakota was painful to the Minnesotan economy. They were conducting raids on trade routes that were crucial to the state. The fur trade, the cornerstone of the Canadian economy, would funnel furs down to Minneapolis and in turn the rest of the U.S. The Minnesotan economy was beginning to feel a squeeze. In addition, many Minnesotans refused to settle and repopulate regions that were caught up in the conflict, even though the Dakota had left. The southern plains of Minnesota were left abandoned as refugees flooded into the Twin Cities. The U.S. government had to do two things. They had to show the Dakota that they were serious about stamping out resistance, and they had to show the American public that the frontier state of Minnesota was secure from further attacks. Now promoted Brigadier General Sibley, a key commander that ended the war against the Dakota, had been tasked by General Pope, commander of the War Department of the Northwest, to pursue the Dakota into the Dakota Territory and stamp out resistance. In what is today North Dakota, the Dakota and local Lakota natives were massing in what is today's Kidder County. Sibley had a couple thousand soldiers and a few dozen native scouts, which was quite a large force, much more bolstered than what he had to manage during the Dakota War proper. The march into the territory from Fort Ridgely was grueling. There was little water, humid July heat, and drought. Sibley had come across a buffalo hunting party and heard word that there was a group of armed natives massing nearby. He'd sent one of his native scouts in parley with the band of some 3,000 natives. Up to half of them were armed braves. Sibley had discovered there were several bands grouped together with two major leaders, Chief Standing Buffalo and War Chief Inkpaduta. We talked about how you can gain the title of War Chief in one of my earlier episodes on Sitting Bull. Standing Buffalo was known to be friendly to whites and more peaceful, but Inkpaduta was notoriously resistant to white expansion. His band had refused to recognize the Treaty of Mendota that gave his land away to the state of Minnesota, and the band that he led lived off the grid away from whites whenever they could. There was a parley where the Scouts and Siouan Braves met on top of what is called the Big Mound. Army Surgeon Josiah S. Weiser approached and greeted several native friends when one of Inkpaduta's followers, Tall Crown, killed him on the mound in front of both Sibley's soldiers and the now retreating bands of natives. Sibley ordered his men forward, while the Siouan Braves took cover in ravines and foliage to slow Sibley's advance. Sibley's mounted rangers circled around the Siouan lines and fired upon the larger group of retreating women and children. The natives escaped westward and Sibley's men took a rest. Sibley counted 9 native braves dead to his 3 killed and 4 wounded soldiers. They went through all the provisions and belongings that the bands had left behind and either destroyed or stole them to keep them from being reused. They pursued westward the next day. Many bands under Standing Buffalo were reluctant to fight and decided to head north to Canada to avoid Sibley's advance. The bands under Inkpaduta, however, met with a band of Lakota reinforcements near Dead Buffalo Lake. Among the Lakota backup was a warrior who was a rising star in the ranks of the most elite warrior classes on the Great Plains, Sitting Bull. There are a few episodes on Sitting Bull earlier this season. Sitting Bull, like Inkpaduta, subscribed to the philosophy that the encroaching white world had nothing to offer the natives of the Great Plains. Colonel Sibley and his regiment arrived on the shores of the lake. The Siouan strategy was to capture Sibley's pack mules to immobilize him in the plains. They made their attempt, but after a skirmish, they were chased away. Thinking the battle was over, Sibley let his cattle graze when the warriors attacked again. It is said, armed with only a whip, Sitting Bull wrangled a mule and escaped, counting coup against Sibley. The natives retreated westward again, and the battle was over. Several natives were reported dead by Sibley to one of his own soldiers. After the last two battles, the retreating natives almost had their backs up to the Missouri River. It was unknown to the Dakota and Lakota natives, but Sibley was counting on General Alfred Sully and 1,200 soldiers that were ascending the Missouri River to pincer the rebellious Siouan tribes and stamp out their resistance. Sibley marched westward. While spread out, the Siouan warriors thought they'd probe for weak points, but Sibley had his column closed up after his half-blood scouts had spotted the Siouan advance. There were a couple thousand combatants on either side. Sibley's forces were on foot, but well armed with better firearm technology. Inkpaduta's and Sitting Bull's forces were much faster on horseback, but with bows and arrows, muskets, and crude melee weapons that were disadvantageous at a distance. The natives made a semicircle around Sibley's forces that spanned several miles, probing for weaknesses. Sibley fired his artillery, knocking several natives down. Both sides reported casualties in the single digits, and the Braves retreated to the Missouri River. Sibley tracked them down and came across them along the river near today's site of the capital of North Dakota, Bismarck. The majority of natives had crossed, but upon their discovery, the final Braves crossed in a hurry, leaving many things behind. A couple of Sibley's soldiers were killed in the skirmish. Sibley camped on the shore of the Missouri River for the next 3 nights and was subject to small-scale attacks. Sitting Bull and Inkpaduta's forces would stampede their livestock, set fire to the prairie, and fire into the soldiers' tents at night. With no sight of reinforcements from Sully, and his men and his horses run down, Sibley decided to abandon the mission and march back to Minnesota. In the end, he would be able to report significant Siouan losses while also successfully pushing them across the Missouri River. The U.S. military was able to flex a presence in the western Dakota Territory, which would be enough to make the war chiefs on the plains think twice before running regular raids on Minnesotan commerce.